You're watching a situation that doesn't make sense at first because it wasn't supposed to be public. Two of the most respected names in Hollywood suddenly arrested. No warning, no buildup, no clear explanation that people can point to and say, that's why. And what's making this even more confusing is who's involved. Keanu Reeves, someone known for staying quiet, avoiding controversy, and never putting himself at the center of anything like this. And Jim Carrey is someone who, for years, has been slowly stepping away from the industry altogether. So when both of their names start trending at the same time, tied to the same situation, people immediately start asking the same question: what actually happened behind the scenes? Because according to multiple reports and growing speculation online, this didn't start with an incident, it started with a warning. A warning that allegedly Keanu gave directly to people inside the industry. A warning that he was prepared to expose something connected to Jim Carrey, and more specifically, something connected to why Jim hasn't looked the same in recent appearances. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable, because this isn't just about rumors online anymore. This is about what happens when someone inside that system decides to speak on it publicly. Because if even part of what's being claimed is true, then this situation didn't escalate randomly, it escalated because something was about to be revealed. And the question now is simple: what exactly was Keanu trying to expose that would lead to both of them being taken into custody at the same time? Now this is where things start to connect, and it all traces back to something that didn't seem important at the time. When Keanu Reeves and Jim Carrey were working together on Sonic the Hedgehog 3, it was supposed to be just another project. Two well-known actors in a recording booth doing voice work, keeping things professional. But according to what's being discussed now, that's not how it played out behind the scenes. Because during those sessions, Keanu reportedly started noticing something that didn't sit right, not with the project, but with Jim. At first, it wasn't obvious. It wasn't something you could point to immediately. It was subtle. The way he spoke, the way he reacted to certain topics, the way conversations would suddenly shift when certain subjects came up. And for someone like Keanu, who's been in this industry for decades and has seen people burn out, disappear, or change over time, this didn't feel like any of that. It felt different. And over time, those small moments turned into private conversations. Conversations where Jim allegedly started opening up about pressure being placed on him, not just to come back to acting, but to present himself a certain way. To say certain things, to avoid saying others. And that's where the situation starts to take a different tone, because this wasn't framed as normal industry pressure. This was described as something more controlled, more deliberate. And according to what's being said, that's the point where Keanu stopped looking at it like speculation and started taking it seriously. And this is where everything starts to shift from something that feels subtle into something that's harder to ignore. Because the more time they spent working together, the more those conversations reportedly changed. What started as small comments turned into something deeper. According to what's being said, Jim began opening up in a way that didn't sound like someone just frustrated with the industry. It sounded like someone who felt watched, controlled, like there were limits on what he could say publicly and consequences for crossing those lines. And for Keanu, that's where things stopped feeling normal, because he's been around long enough to understand how Hollywood works. He knows about contracts, pressure, public image, all of it, but this didn't sound like any of those things. This sounded like someone who believed there was a version of himself being pushed into the spotlight that wasn't fully him anymore. And that's when the focus shifts to Jim's public appearances. Because people had already started noticing something on their own. The way he looked in recent footage, the way he moved, the way he responded in interviews, it didn't match what audiences had been used to for years. And those observations were already circulating online before any of this even surfaced. So now you have two things happening at the same time. Public speculation about his appearance and private conversations suggesting something deeper might be going on behind the scenes. And according to the claims being discussed, that's the moment Keanu allegedly connected those dots. Not as a rumor, but as something he believed might actually be real. And this is the point where everything reportedly escalates. Because up until now, it's conversations, observations, things that can still be dismissed as speculation or misinterpretation. But according to what's being said, that changed the moment Keanu decided to act on it. Not publicly at first, but directly. The claim is that he reached out behind the scenes, speaking to people within the industry, making it clear that he wasn't comfortable with what he was seeing. And more importantly, that he wasn't going to stay quiet about it. Now, whether that started as concern or frustration isn't entirely clear. But what is being repeated across multiple discussions is that the tone shifted quickly. Because this wasn't framed as someone asking questions anymore, it was framed as someone preparing to expose something. Specifically, something connected to Jim's recent appearances and the growing speculation around them. And that's where the situation becomes a lot more serious. Because in an industry built on image, control, and perception, the idea of someone publicly challenging that system, especially someone like Keanu who doesn't usually involve himself in controversy, starts to raise alarms. And according to what's being claimed, that's exactly what happened. The moment those warnings were taken seriously, the response was immediate. Not public statements, not denials, something much quieter but much more direct. Because shortly after those alleged conversations took place, both Keanu and Jim were suddenly tied to the same situation. And instead of answers, what followed was confusion. Because from the outside, it didn't look like a buildup. It looked like a sudden stop. And that's what's making people question what actually triggered it. And this is where everything suddenly shifts from speculation into something that people can't ignore anymore. Because according to what's being reported and discussed across multiple platforms, this didn't just stay behind closed doors. It didn't stay as quiet conversations or private warnings. At some point, it crossed a line. The claim is that Keanu didn't just raise concerns. He allegedly made it clear that he was willing to speak publicly if things didn't change. And that's the moment people point to as the turning point. Because once that kind of statement is made, especially in an industry like this, it stops being about opinions. It becomes a risk, a liability, something that has to be contained before it reaches a wider audience. And then, almost immediately after that shift, everything happens at once. Reports start surfacing that both Keanu Reeves and Jim Carrey have been detained. No clear explanation. No detailed public breakdown of what led up to it, just confirmation that something serious had taken place behind the scenes. And that's what's fueling the reaction online, because the timing doesn't feel random. It doesn't feel disconnected. It feels like cause and effect, like something was said or about to be said and it triggered a response. And at the same time, the conversation around Jim's appearance starts getting louder again. People going back to footage, comparing older clips to recent ones, pointing out differences they can't explain. And now, instead of those observations being dismissed as internet speculation, they're being tied directly into this situation. Because if Keanu was really preparing to expose something connected to that, then this isn't just about how things look anymore. It's about why they look that way. And this is where the situation starts to split completely. Because now it's not just one narrative anymore, it's two. On one side, you have people saying this is exactly what it looks like. That Keanu stepped out of line, made serious claims without proof, and the situation escalated the moment it crossed into something public. From that perspective, the arrests aren't mysterious, they're a response. A consequence of pushing something too far. But on the other side, there's a completely different interpretation gaining traction. And that version focuses less on what was said and more on how quickly everything happened after it was said. Because people are pointing to the timing again. The fact that this all seemed to unfold immediately after those alleged warnings. The fact that both names ended up tied together at the exact same moment. And for a lot of people watching this play out, that coincidence feels too precise to ignore. So now the conversation shifts again. Not just what happened, but why now? Why did everything move the second this started getting attention? And why involve both of them at the same time? Because if this was just about one person speaking out, then why is the other person suddenly part of the same situation? And that's where things start to feel more complicated. Because the more you look at it, the less it feels like two separate issues, and the more it starts to look like one connected situation. One that, depending on how you see it, either stopped something from spreading or confirmed that there was something there to stop in the first place. And now everything leads to this moment where there are more questions than answers. Because from the outside, what people can actually confirm is limited. Two major names suddenly connected to the same situation with very little explanation that fully makes sense of the timing. And that's what keeps this from settling. Because usually when something like this happens, details follow. Statements are released. Clarifications are made. A clear narrative forms that people can either accept or challenge. But here, that clarity hasn't come. And when that gap exists, people start filling it themselves. Some are looking at this as a situation that escalated too far too fast, that Keanu made claims he couldn't back up, that things got out of control, and that the response was simply a way to shut it down before it spread any further. But others are looking at the same sequence of events and seeing something completely different. They're focusing on the timing, on the connection between the claims and the response, and asking whether this wasn't just about stopping something, but stopping it before it reached a point where it couldn't be contained. And that's where this situation stays unresolved, because without a clear explanation, both interpretations continue to exist at the same time. And the more people look back at everything, the conversations, the appearances, the sudden shift, the harder it becomes to separate what's confirmed from what's being questioned. Which brings everything back to the same final thought. If someone was really willing to risk everything to speak on something like this, what exactly did they believe was true? And if the response came that quickly, was it to correct a narrative, or to prevent one from ever fully forming?